Thank you for attending this session. I'll be Dutch and brief in my approach. I am indeed from Amsterdam, and growing up in Amsterdam in the 60s and 70s overwhelms you with, let's call it, dimensions of learning, and certainly dimensions of choice. You need to, as a very young adult, deal with all sorts of what I'd like to refer to as sex, drugs, and rock and roll at an age when you're really not ready for that whatsoever. Yet you have parents who teach you one thing, which they call responsibility, the ability to respond in other ways. And so, indeed, I was very happy to be Dutch, because in Holland we have a rather in-your-face type of mentality about this. It's there, you're going to deal with it in your way, and it's not going to go away. As a matter of fact, it's coming back. The more you try to legalize certain things or make them illegal, the more they come back in different ways, which is a wonderful way to think about what Yuri just called an unfamiliar problem in a very unfamiliar setting. So I was happy to be born and raised in Amsterdam, and then I made various mistakes here, the first three. I became a lawyer. I became an intellectual property lawyer. I quickly realized that I liked the creativity and the protection perhaps of innovation of it, but I didn't really like lawyers whatsoever. I then switched. I went to New York City and became a publisher, first a legal counsel, I suppose we call it here, then a publisher in scientific, technical, and medical publishing. And there again I learned something about culture, because those in one scientific discipline would not approve nor talk to others in another discipline, and I was meant to sell their books in a booth on a conference for their specialty. And every single professor, although kind in the way that they wanted to share with me how I should organize my booth, always put their own books, of course, face out, and I named it manage space. So managing space and culture is, of course, very, very important in our learning. I went to that institute that Yuri Boschik went to, so I've known Yuri now for more than 15, 16 years. I did do an MBA as well. I still call it mediocre but arrogant. That's basically what I learned there. And then I spent a lot of time with von Strompenaars, and of course homage to Edgar Schein, and an old friend, Charles Hampden Turner, sends his regards to you, with whom I studied dilemma management, again about cultural differences and how do we deal with and approach culture in a productive learning setting. And that comes with BDAL, or business-driven action learning. Yuri touched upon that very, very briefly. I'll elaborate with one quick example. Currently, I'm what they call independent, so I work a lot with Duke Corporate Education. I'm on their advisory board for India. I have a love relationship with India. Not only did I used to be married to a woman from India and have two kids who speak Bengali fluently. They're both here in Cambridge, by the way. But also I have the pleasure of working with a lot of Indian corporations on Indian-style leadership development and executive development programs, which are, at this point, a little far from action learning, if I may say so myself. TAC, executive development, various companies, Indian School of Business in Hyderabad, where I go at least 2 or 3 times a year. I have some private clients, and I hold strongly to this sense that we all take to heart. Learning needs to be greater than the rate of change, and certainly in the last 20 years, rate of change has been enormous, helped by and enabled by, of course, technology, but the learning styles, the learning ways, the pedagogy, as Mr. Sengi said, Professor Sengi said yesterday, has not changed sufficiently. And I think we can do more. Very briefly then, what have I learned? Indeed, here are some of the principles of business-driven action learning. It starts with those responsible, in the end, for learning. And those are the executives, and I don't just mean the human resource people. I mean the line managers as well. And they need to be engrossed in what I call dilemmas. Dilemmas are seemingly opposing value propositions that are both true at the same time and need to become true. The combination of these are scarce, therefore often quite profitable. And that coincides with the knowledge and learning and understanding of collective intelligence. Equal weight given to what we call the PCs, the personal challenge, the personal dilemma, work-life being one of them, obviously, but also how do I follow rules and still create exceptional behavior? How do I follow leadership styles and still create my own different way of doing it without becoming a robot? Mobilization of those inside and outside of the organization. One of the things I learn in action learning sets is that those people who know least, have least expertise, have the greatest and deepest insights and are willing to ask what were earlier called the stupid question, which I think we have to stop calling that. They are the best questions, and they're the only questions that really enhance learning. Following then information and knowledge capture and sharing. Yesterday, Anjali Shastri said it's very hard to take all that bundle of learning that we have online now and scale it and disseminate it. And of course, the best way that all of us learn is through a story, an example. 3 minutes. This is what I took away. And so we have to find ways with social networking to actually learn to tell stories. 7 dimensions of learning. It's in Yuri's handout, if you have the handout and the reading. I think it's a marvelous way to learn how to reflect about the greater context within which I work, the organization, the team, the individual, and for me always the most interesting questions are the last 3, which is, what have I learned about the way that I learn? So if I do any kind of work, any kind of teaching, any kind of facilitation, it's got to be about the way that I learn. And if I haven't changed the way that I learn, I'm basically doing the same thing over and over again. I'm falling into bad and good habits. If I want that, it's okay. But if I never question myself, that is meaningless. And the fourth to last dimension of that, and again, it's in Yuri's write-up, is really about who else needs to know. And that goes back to leaders are teachers, teachers are lifelong learners. A very important part. The teamwork, and I think everybody has tools and developments of that. I don't think that's exceptional to any kind of business-driven action learning that I've done. The outside in is, there is nothing that compares to taking 7 executives from a worldwide beer brewer to India 3 years ago, and none of them had ever been to India. And these were experienced men and women, 35 years of age. I was what I like to call the learning facilitator of the team. And luckily I had some cultural competence, perhaps, so I could help them out of tuk-tuks. If anybody's been to India, you know what it means, and losing your belongings, but also all the good things of India that are particularly there in terms of the relationships that you seem to create almost constantly, both emotionally and, may I add, physically. Those of you who have been to India, you know there's nothing like a crowded street there. So there again, coming back to the BCs, the business challenge, and the PCs is so utterly important. Then the follow-up, there again, it comes down to what I call the ROI. It's a popular term, but the return on the investment of learning. Too many people still talk to me about a program, a learning and development event, and when I ask them, where in the organization do you fit? Are you a profit center or are you a cost center? And 9 out of 10 times I'm a cost center. And I think it's wrong. The mentality is wrong. Nobody ever questioned, why should we not benefit from learning? And certainly the learning of the collective, of the group. So that needs to be instilled, that needs to be followed up, but it links back to the first point, of course, which is the senior executives involved. Are they really willing to review the purpose of learning in their organization? And those are most of the questions that I have. Therefore, the role of what I here call the cross-cultural learning facilitator. I was very fortunate to fall into culture through academia, through publishing, and then end up with 2 very deep thinkers, von Strompenaars and Charles Hampden Turner, that introduced me to the field of how do we actually learn? And therefore, Jason J is not here, but his question earlier, how do we take students further into this area of learning, is through the cross-cultural route. You have to ask really deep questions about assumptions of learning, assumptions of issues that I'm not even aware of as a Dutchman. Because as Dutch people, we never sit around talking about our Dutchness, nor do any of us. Not even with a good pint of Guinness, I would say. In Ireland, we don't really reflect on who we are. Now that could be a really good learning set around assumptions for cross-culture. And I met some companies who do it. When culture and strategy clash, culture always wins. So whatever plan you put on paper, culture will destroy it. My example, this is not the actual set. I took 40 individuals with 22 nationalities from 26 locations of one company. It was a financial service company, 8-day course on the basis of the principles that I just shared with you, 12 months engagement. So there was an 8-day phase, and then there were remote interactions. We rented 6 catamarans with 6 or 7 people on it and 1 learning facilitator, plus a very experienced captain and a Navy SEAL, because things happened to go wrong sometimes. Nobody knew how to sail, so they needed to learn how to navigate. They needed to learn the roles necessary to float a ship like this, and in the Chesapeake Bay, not easy, differing winds. They had to sleep there. By the way, there were 6 berths, meaning 6 places to sleep, and 7 people on board. So you can imagine gender differences, some people very gung-ho and sleeping on deck, and then the temperature drops. What do you do? So there were lots of personal learnings as well. Each participant brought in a program, a project I should say, so that was different than the traditional Revens way, where it develops. They were experts, they brought it together, they needed to work together on how to sustain their projects, but also make the 1 million project ready. And indeed, after the course, they had a number of interactions. Why I bring this example is to make one simple point. If we change looking at action learning from a point of view of a cost and bums on seats because we need the money, for example, we are never going to benefit. The lowest total gain from this particular course, you would say 40 people, $1 million each, must be $40 million if everybody is successful. But that's where we're wrong. The lowest ever recorded total was $64 million. So $24 million in what I call collective intelligence by doing the personal and the business challenge together. As a matter of fact, my project would never be successful without your help. And that's, I think, an essential learning that can be applied to semi-academia setups, as well as, of course, in the private business sector, with which I've done some what they call collaborative enterprises. So that's my talk. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
I'm curious, as we are transitioning to the next speaker, what was your biggest failure in a global project like this? Let me just speak to that. Did this ever fail, or does it always work?
No,
64 million, catamarans, Navy SEALs, it sounds very exciting.
It's a good question, because I was thinking, should I put up a failure? And then I thought, no, well, this is America. Maybe not. So, but I live in Cambridge, by the way, and I feel very American. So, but no, I chose this. But the biggest failure was indeed where I, as a learning facilitator, jumped in and became part, and as Reg Revens would say, distorted the natural team flow, and got immediate feedback on it, or immediate as in we had regular action learning sets. And so you learn very quickly what your mistakes are, which I love. But trying to help people, sometimes the opposite is exactly what you get. You distort the natural flow, the natural path of nature, as Zengi said yesterday. So I've definitely made that mistake, and I think most people should avoid that.
I'll tell you a story first. This company makes hydraulic systems. Like if you have a car that the roof goes up and down, they make the hydraulic system. It's a European company. And they brought together some of their suppliers to say, well, let's work together in an action learning way to improve our collaborative supply chain relationships. They met monthly over a period of 2 years with a facilitator, an academic facilitator. And at the outset, they identified all sorts of issues that they wanted to deal with, things like cost overruns and delays, reducing costs, all those kind of economic, practical, kind of operational kind of issues. Now, supplier A had this issue. I'll call it a puzzle, being very technical in action learning terms. They made this little plastic insert that went into the machine that had to do with the hydraulics. And that little insert melted under pressure. And supplier A struggled with this over 2.5 years. They had all sorts of consultants in, engineers, but this little thing, and they strengthened the plastic, but it kept melting under pressure. Of course, they never told the system integrator that this was happening. They just carried they had a 35% scrappage rate. So every time for every 100 they make, they had to throw away 35. So it was costing them a lot of money, but they didn't tell the system integrator in case the system integrator cancelled the relationship. But as this action learning group moved and developed, and they began to talk to one another in a more trusting kind of way, they shared this issue. And the system integrator said, well, we'll help you with this. We'll bring our engineering skill and expertise to bear on this. So they began to address that. And that went on over a couple of months. Anyway, basically they solved it, right? They solved it in 2 ways. First of all, the little plastic insert, they made it out of glass instead, or fiberglass or something, so that stopped it melting. But secondly, what supplier B, who was also in the group, supplier B made another component that was adjoining to the component that supplier A made. And supplier B changed how they made what they did. Right? So the outcome was not only that what the little insert, that component that supplier A made was altered, but also there was a systemic perspective whereby the adjoining part that fitted in alongside that in this hydraulic system was also changed. That's the story, right? Now, so let me stand back and kind of talk a little bit about this. Okay, first of all, we're talking about a supply network. And as you know, in today's global world, it's networks really that compete. And a network is as good as its supply chain relationships. In other words, people deliver on time, within a cost, so on and so on. So networks are really where a lot of contemporary business stuff is at. So this network began as essentially what the literature would call a strategic network. In other words, what they wanted to do was basically sort out the economics and the finances, cut costs, reduce delays, make the thing as cost effective and as efficient as possible. And a lot of networks start in that kind of mode. But as they began to meet, and particularly in an action learning mode, they began to trust one another more. They began to share, as supplier A did, share this issue that had been, this puzzle that it had for ages. And they moved to becoming a learning network and a transformational network, whereby change, so when various changes took place, they took place in several of the companies. So rather than the system integrator saying to a supplier, you need to sort out your system, they would both say, we need to sort out our systems, which may mean a change in you, and it may also mean some kind of change in us as well. So the relationship developed. And this relationship became involved, what I suppose in sports parlance you might talk about home and away. So it was the away was when this group met. And after the meeting, the various managers, purchasing managers, engineering managers, and so on, would go back to their own organizations, and they would have to begin to implement changes at home, bring that back to the away in a month's time or 6 weeks' time, and so on. So there was this home and away dynamic whereby there was influencing going on at the intergroup level, the inter-organizational level, which then had impact back on the organizational level and back forward again. So I suppose really what I want to open up the questions are really about, because most action learning, when you read the literature and so on, is all about action learning within an organization. And the action learning sets or action learning groups are groups of managers within an organization who are working on various kinds of issues. So here we have a notion of where the action learning group is made up of managers from different organizations. And of course, that then creates all sorts of questions about leadership, particularly if the system integrator, by and large, in this case, the system integrator was quite a big company, while the suppliers were by and large small, family-owned engineering firms. So, of course, a manager of one organization cannot tell a manager of another organization what to do. So, therefore, the emphasis is on developing collaborative relationships where they can work together. So, the group was inter-organizational. The problem they were working on was how to improve their collaborative relationships, strategic collaborative improvement relationships. So that was the problem, that was the task. The melting part was simply a puzzle. There was a technical problem. There was an engineering answer to it somewhere if they could find it. But that became the vehicle by which they were able to improve their trusting relationships and work together and so on. And they met, as I say, they met monthly. They were able to explore in a reflective, questioning way and ask questions and the open-ended questions and so on that Yuri was talking about earlier. And they had a commitment to action. They certainly wanted to improve their working relationships and improve their network productivity and competitiveness, but they also had a commitment to learning. And it was in that context that Supplier A was able to say, look, we've had this issue for years. We haven't had the courage to tell you about it, but here's what's happening for us. So I think in action learning theory terms, this notion of network action learning or inter-organizational action learning is worth exploring because of the whole nature of the way supply chains work and how organizations who have a supply chain relationship need to work together more collaboratively and so on as key to business. That's basically the story, that's basically the theory. I don't know where I am on my 10 minutes. But that story is in the article that's in your little pack. There's an article in the pack that you all picked up, and that story is written up in that.
That's where you are.
Oh, that's where I am, okay. And secondly then, I have a book which is also referenced in that. I'm not good academic if I don't say I have a book. All right. So I have a book then that describes this and other projects, because this was a European project, European funded project that involved different supply chain networks across Europe that cross various kind of borders. And out of that, we've also developed a kind of a way of talking about action learning research as a way of using the kind of mechanisms of the group to generate data and so on. Yeah, I've had enough, said enough. Thank you very much.
So maybe just an immediate question from Ed Schein, and then...
I'm intrigued that your learning unit is a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so far I've been learning about individuals learning, or groups learning, or organizations learning.
Mm.
But I have not yet encountered someone who said, wait a minute, the problem is not in a human defined thing, but in an abstraction called a relationship.
Mm.
That as a learning unit seems to me a very intriguing concept, because it's much harder to conceptualize, and each pair in the network is a different relationship, but you want them each to learn.
Yeah.
Just an observation.
Yeah, we were very clear that the level of analysis, to use that kind of language, was the network, not the firm. Just as the level of analysis can be a group, of which then individuals, members are the components. This was, we were really trying to articulate, and we're very clear, because there was, as part of this project, there must have been, I think, about 8 PhD students who were part, and they were the one facilitating these meetings and so on. But the level of analysis was very clearly the network. And I think there's a growing literature on kind of levels or networks and as a level of analysis. Just as politically, things like the EU is a level of analysis. You know, I think made up of all the different component nation states and so on. Yeah. So I think there's a great area for development in all that, but there's not much of it out of action learning. Yeah.
So as Maria can start setting up, I just wanted to ask you a last question. So how, we are in Massachusetts now, and action learning, I guess, goes on, and it doesn't get headlines every day. How is it in Dublin? Are you kind of a hero on the streets? Is action learning, you know,
well, I'm not standing in my own field, of course. There's a huge amount of action learning in the Irish health system, for example. There's action learning groups all over the health system. There's a huge amount of action learning in hospitals, and these are people who come together to address issues and so on. And again, based on the premise that Yuri talked about, is that the expertise is in the people who do the work and who have the issue. And the minimal use of not getting experts in, not getting consultants in to talk. I was at a conference recently, and the head of one of the biggest hospital in Ireland spoke, and he said the most exciting thing that was going on in his hospital was all the various action research and action learning groups that were generating change from within right across the whole system.
Thank you.
Well, they mightn't know about me at all, but that's a different thing.
My passion and belief that the only way you're going to learn about the world is to put your feet on the ground in different parts of the world. My children, my 3 sons, have had to live that personally. I got the result of that, which is all 3 of my sons are incredibly international young men now. And I'm lucky if they all live in the same country at any moment in time. So there is a negative aspect to that as well. At the Stanford Graduate School of Business, we have a tagline: change lives, change organizations, change the world. And I know it sounds lofty, but actually if you talk to anybody in the community, whether it's faculty or staff, current students or alumni, they believe this. And we all live this and work towards this every day. Given today's topic about learning leadership in a borderless environment, I'm going to focus on changing the world. Obviously, given the name of my center as well, this is an area in which I spend a lot of time. The MBA program decided probably 6 or 7 years ago that the only way that they were going to truly prepare MBA students to be global leaders was to help them to understand the world in which we expect them to make changes. And the only way that they were going to truly understand the world was to get out there and put their feet on the ground. And the administration created something called the Global Experience Requirement. So this is a requirement for every MBA student. They must participate in at least one of a number of different programs that my center runs that allows them different types of experiences, some very fast, intense, broad snapshots of a country, others more long-term internships that allow them a more immersive experience, exchange programs that allow for more personal relationships with different cultures. They basically have a menu, and we encourage them to pick as many as they can fit into the 2 years that they are with us. The participants in these programs obviously learn a lot about the countries and the regions that they travel to. They meet with different business leaders. They learn about the culture. They do karaoke in Japan, and they eat dal in India. They experience it firsthand. They meet with many business leaders, talk about the economic challenges that those countries have. And they come back with great learning experiences, and it's been a very positive experience. But what I'm actually going to focus on today is a byproduct of this global experience requirement. When Stanford decided that they're going to send every single one of their students on some kind of program, instead of hiring a bunch of staff to run all of these programs, they decided to invite the second-year MBA students to act as leaders for their peers in these experiences. I wasn't here at the time. It could have been because they were cheap. It could have been because they thought that this was actually going to be a learning opportunity. It's not clear. But over the past 5 years, it's become very clear that being a leader in one of these global experiences is the most powerful leadership learning opportunity probably available during their entire 2 years as an MBA student. And I'm going to illustrate this actually by telling the story of one of those students, and I'm going to call him Eric. Eric came to the MBA program as the first person from his country. So he came from a Middle Eastern country, and we had never had a student from this country before. And before he even got to the GSB, to the Graduate School of Business, he had heard about our global study trips, our global experience requirement, et cetera. And he was committed to being a leader of his peers to take them to his country, because being a Middle Eastern country, he recognized that there was a perception about the economic opportunities there, and he wanted to share the positive business opportunities to his peers. So before he even arrived, this was something that he thought was very important to him. So when he got here, within the first 2 weeks, the MBA students have a chance to sign up for what kinds of trips and programs that they want to do. And Eric decided to sign up for 2 different global study trips because he wanted to make sure that he learned how to lead a trip. And so he went on one in the winter break and one in the spring break. That's when we run these programs. And in addition to learning what all the other participants learned about those countries that he was traveling to, and all of the participants, by the way, have to choose a country that's new to them. So they're all going somewhere they've never worked and never lived. So Eric had a chance to learn about 2 different countries and experience the cultural and the business opportunities there. But he also spent the time studying the leaders. So the leaders of those trips were, in a sense, his teachers. And he recognized what worked and what didn't work and the things that he'd like to do different and the changes that he would like to make. So that was his first learning opportunity. By the end of his first year, he was gung-ho on doing this. But to propose to lead a trip, which is actually a competitive process, we have more people who want to be leaders than we have opportunities for them, he had to develop a team. So the teams have to have 4 or 5 students that are leaders. So he had to find these other students that wanted to work extraordinarily hard to lead a trip to a country that was not their country, and would be as passionate and motivated about this as he was. So he'd actually known that, had been working all year on identifying these. So great leadership challenge. Do I choose my best friends that I get along with really well? Do I choose other individuals that bring a different diversity of thought, a different culture, a different skill set that complements my own? So he had to go through that challenge. He, in the end, ended up with 4 additional leaders. The 5 of them developed a proposal for the trip. It's an extensive 30-page proposal around a theme, identifying everything about the trip they want to do. And then they actually have to present to us in the Global Center what that trip, what educational content that trip will have. So he has this group of 4 other students, and he has to motivate them, and they have to exhibit that they work together, that they can collaborate, because in the end we actually choose the proposals based as much on the theme and the location as on the strength of the leadership team. So our belief that at the end of the day, these 4 or 5 young people can actually take 25 students to a country that those 25 students have never been to and have no experience with, and we prefer if they bring them all back alive. So we have, that's an extraordinarily important part of how we judge this. So Eric, to me, obviously, his proposal was chosen, and his team needed to move forward now to make this happen. We've identified over the years that this leadership opportunity is particularly powerful, so we've put some things in place to build on this in the action learning style. So in addition to just throwing them out there to do this, we have advisors in my office that are available to help them think about how they're going to work as a team and approach this issue. And we've actually developed a class specifically for the students who are leading trips. And we require that at least 1 student from each of the leadership teams, so we have 20 to 23 teams per year, participate in this class with one of our faculty who is particularly focused on leadership and organizations and that type of thing. And it is a class, the students do show up, but it's very much about this peer-to-peer learning. So they use as a context a case, a situation, as simple as you got somewhere, the bus is ready to go to the airport, and 3 members of your group didn't show up. How, as a leadership team, are you going to decide how to do that? And then the individuals in the room work together and they realize how many different solutions there might be and the different styles of leadership. So Eric was a member of that class as well. So Eric had chosen one of his best friends to be on the team, and that didn't go so well. They lived together and they had a falling out, and it turned into a huge conflict and a crisis. And the team had to deal with this issue of the two of them wouldn't even be in the same room with each other. So they came to us, and our job is not to solve it. Our job is to challenge them to figure out how to solve it. So we asked them, what are you going to do to make this work? And first they thought they should meet with their faculty advisor. Every group has a faculty member. Our faculty member said, hey, I'm not taking sides. I don't get involved in this, which was fine, very fair. So then they came back to us and said, we'd like a coach. So we got them a coach, and the coach met with them. And they worked through this. And in the end, the young man, not Eric, but the other person that was his friend, decided to drop off the leadership team. It was an extraordinarily challenging situation. Everybody was so invested. They had worked so hard. But the team recognized that for the good of the participants and the good of the outcome, it was right for this other person to leave and not Eric, because Eric was the only one on the team that was actually from the country they were traveling to. And so even the person who stepped down recognized that this was the right decision. This was a huge leadership, growing up, maturing process for all of them. So in the end, these 4 leaders led this trip. They went to a country in the Middle East. It was amazingly successful. All of the participants, the faculty member, thought they learned so much. It was fantastic. When we debriefed, I asked the team, so tell me about this experience for you. Basically, the hardest thing they've ever done, the toughest quarter they can ever remember in life, but the best learning opportunity they could imagine. Afterwards, I talked to Eric on his own, and I'm going to end by just what he told me. And he said, I learned so much about myself, so much about working with others, so much about the variety of cultures, because obviously he had a culture diversity on his team. And in fact, just the 2 people who had the conflict, it was a cultural issue. They were both from different parts of the world, not from the US, and their definition of personal space is what ended up causing their conflict. They lived together, and they had extraordinarily different versions of what that meant. He said, leading in the midst of all of this diversity and learning about this was amazing. He said, but an added benefit, which was interesting, was I fell in love with my country all over again. He said, being able to share my country and seeing it through the eyes of my peers opened me up to the opportunity my country had and the role that I could play as a leader in that country. So an amazing learning opportunity that was never really part of the original global experience requirement.
So the faculty advisor role, does the faculty actually travel with the group?
Yes, they do, but they have very little other, we have very little other expectations of them, to be honest. Prior to the trip, the student leaders have to lead a number of educational sessions. They're required to prepare at least 7 hours of pre-trip education. And the faculty member often takes part in those and at times becomes a speaker or whatever. But we actually consider it more of a learning opportunity for the faculty member as well. They're often going to a country that they have never been to as well. And so...
that was sort of point of information.
Yeah.
I guess my real question is, what do you think is the appropriateness of having a student from a country lead the group? My concern with that is often the population that you get recruited to go to school here are from elites, and some of the problem you get is that they don't really see their own country.
Sure.
They go with blinders, and you'll have very closed networks.
Sure.
And I think pedagogically, I would hope there's some checks for that, because that could be a real problem.
It is a challenge that we put upon the student groups as part of the proposal, is that they needed to provide a version of an authentic view of their country. We challenged them to show both ends of the economic spectrum. We challenged them to show diverse points of view. A good example is we almost always have a trip that goes to Israel. It's often led by Israelis. They obviously can't go to Palestine while they're there. But we make sure that a part of their programming and a part of the learning opportunity is to have Palestinian speakers or to have someone address the issues and the challenges. So that's true of every trip, that we need to make sure that they're looking at both sides of the equation, going to Saudi Arabia and understanding the women's role and situation as well. So that's part of our job in reviewing the proposals.
I'll take a super quick question from you.
Do I need this? Guy Pfefferman, Global Business School Network. Maria, I'm interested in the degree of distance that there is culturally between the students and the organizations that they're working with. Yesterday, Anjali showed us some examples of students working on hospitals in Africa or something like this. That's a vast distance. To what extent do the students go to places which are in a different country but of the same kind of organization that they would meet in the US, like a business and so on and so forth?
So we offer this menu of options that students can choose from, and some of them have a much further distance. So one of these global study trips was in Rwanda, and another one in Kenya, where they lived in the huts of a community for a couple days and spoke about aid issues and economic challenges, et cetera. And then other trips can go to Western Europe. We had one that hit, Brussels, London, and Amsterdam. And so there's a variety, and we challenge the students to experience as much of that variety, but also we challenge the students to pick the trip that is going to be most important to them when they think about their career choices and how they want to learn and grow. So some of our students are very socially minded, and they might choose 3 different things that are all like that Kenya or Rwanda trip, but we give them the options.
My name is Goran Todorovic. I'm the Associate Director of the Tuck Global Consultancy Program. It is a second-year elective course for our MBAs at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. And basically what we do is we send out teams of 6 to 8 students all over the world to conduct management consulting engagements. The projects include our companies and the organizations we work for include multinationals as well as not-for-profits and NGOs. Projects last between 13 and 15 weeks, with the middle 3 weeks being in country, and that's a very focused and a very intensive time that the students are working in the field, and it's considered full-time work, whereas the 2 phases that both precede and follow those 3 weeks are on a part-time basis that they're doing back at the Tuck School. We do offer 2 cycles, one in the summer and one in the winter, and that's often dictated by the academic calendar. What we believe that makes the Tuck Global Consultancy so unique and one of the most robust student consultancies in the world is the level of investment by the client sponsor, primarily time, but also money. Clients pay for all of the project-related costs for a particular engagement. We're talking airfare, accommodation, meals, entry visas, etc., and upwards to $100,000 per engagement. And so it's fully funded by the client. And as a result, we believe that this sets the bar very, very high, and the clients are expecting meaningful deliverables with actionable results and recommendations. By making our projects as real-world and practical as possible while still technically being an academic exercise, we think and we believe that we're providing a forum for students to not only learn but also develop their leadership skills. Ideally by incorporating their work experience before coming to business school, as well as what they've learned in the classroom, and sort of combine all those areas. We do our best to manage everyone's expectations, so the constituents that are involved are the clients themselves, the students, of course, and the team advisors. We have a team advisor that's with the team the entire time in country, and in both the preceding and the post phase on a part-time basis. We do put a tremendous amount of time in vetting a project scope of work. We filter the students that are in the program through an interview and application process, and we identify team advisors who are going to push the team to meet the client's objectives, but also to encourage the students themselves to meet their own objectives for participating in the program. And what's that? So how do students specifically develop these leadership skills? I think mainly we give our students as much independence and autonomy to handle the project and the scope of work as they see fit. Team advisors are not there necessarily to be the boss. They're there to coach, to mentor, and sort of facilitate that relationship, ensuring that the students are hitting their milestones. And the students are in direct communication with the client and in effect are managing that relationship. So we hand that off to them as soon as possible. In addition to this, students are encouraged to delegate team responsibilities as they see fit. For example, oftentimes a team will have a client liaison which handles that communication directly with the client, so one client isn't necessarily speaking to 8 students. We also encourage students to perhaps take on and take on sort of the internal strategy and leadership roles in terms of handling the work streams or spearheading the initiative to put together the presentation deck, storyboarding, and things like that. And we just feel that the more we encourage them to do that, the more willing they are to take on those leadership positions. We feel that many of our students participate in this program and expect to be outside their comfort zone. So whether it's a new environment due to culture, due to the industry, due to the subject matter, they know and they're expecting to be outside of their comfort zone because they feel that and so do we, that's the best way for them to learn new issues. And then given the model that I just explained, we encourage our students to deal with these issues in order to add to their learning as well as their leadership experience specifically. And so we hope to provide them a safe environment, so to speak, where they have one foot in the real world and then one still in academia. Unfortunately, this model does have its challenges. The cost in particular is very prohibitive to many clients, so we unfortunately can only do about 10 a year. But we are looking at ways where we can perhaps supplement some of that cost, especially for nonprofits, because we're getting a lot of interest from nonprofits, and a lot of students are interested in getting into that field. So I appreciate your time and attention. I hope my brief explanation of the Tuck Global Consultancy is helpful in regards to what you guys are doing, and thank you very much.
Could you say a little bit about how you teach them consulting skills themselves? How does a student at that stage know how to engage a client and deal with all the dilemmas?
Yeah, we're hoping that they're going to have some knowledge of that before coming to Tuck, but we also have a first-year program that's compulsory for all the students that is more domestically focused, and there's a lot more secondary research involved with that also engages an outside client sponsor, if you will. So hopefully it builds upon that. And then we ensure that there's at least one student who has done consulting or will go into consulting that's on the team to sort of bring that knowledge as well. And the team advisors often have consulting experience themselves.
I have a question for yourself and Maria. I was thinking about this too when I was listening to your presentation. What's the language requirements when you go to different countries? Language requirements.
Go ahead.
We have no language requirements, including when we place students in these internships in different countries. We ask the sponsoring organization to provide a project that the person can actually do in English. Occasionally they can specify or prefer. The most common is a Latin American country that will prefer someone who speaks Spanish. Because the students have to go to a country that's new to them, except for situations like Spanish, it's a challenge for someone to have that language experience if they've never worked or lived in that country. So we have to find sponsors who do business or at least have a portion of their company that does business in English so the student can come in and do the project in English.
And all of our final deliverables are in English, but sometimes clients do request that they have it in, whether it's Mandarin if we're in China, Portuguese if we're in Brazil, etc. When we staff our teams, along with having someone who's done consulting before, we like to get 2 students who have that language or cultural competency for the venue that we'll be in. Not necessarily to be interpreters, but just sort of to add those sort of little nuances that you wouldn't necessarily get from being in a country that you've never been to before. So there are instances where we don't have. 2 years ago, I was a team advisor for a team in Lithuania, and we didn't have any students who spoke Lithuanian. So we actually hired 3 students from local universities who in effect became adjunct team members with our team of 6 students, and kind of they were there for, as interpreters for us, for interviews in the field, etc. So we find a way.
So we
Great.
don't get the-
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so Anjali referred last night to the fact that we've been working on an impact assessment of our course, GHD Lab, which is an action-based field experience that sends students mainly to countries in Africa as well as India to partner with organizations on the front lines of healthcare delivery. So the first question is, why did we decide we wanted to do this impact assessment of our multiple iterations of GHD Lab? And one of the reasons was because we go and visit these organizations repeatedly when students are in the field in the winter or the spring. We realized there were stories we were hearing from the organizations about the value of our projects that weren't being captured by our survey that we send at the end of the course, asking the host organizations how the experience was for them. So that was one reason. And then the other reason was we had a lot of our alumni asking, what's the impact of your course? And we actually realized that's a pretty good question, and we're interested in that too. So let's figure out a way to do that. So here's just a quick overview of GHD Lab that Anjali didn't include last night, but some of the numbers: 41 class projects. We've had 31 host organizations in 11 countries. We've had over 153 students. We have over 250 alumni and friends of GHD Lab worldwide. The other sort of pieces of information I'd add to this is 22 of our organizations do work directly with patients. And our projects have been clustered in basically 3 main areas. One is process and supply chain improvement. Another is extending the reach and service to patients. And the third is developing new lines of business or models to increase sustainability or healthcare delivery. So one of my previous identities has been in qualitative research. So I helped design the qualitative portion of our study. And we got to speak with 29 of 30 of our past host organizations. The only one we couldn't speak to was no longer in existence. We did speak to organizations that had 35 of our 36 projects. We had over 60 respondents. 35 of those interviews were one-on-one, and 8 of those interviews were group interviews that were done at the organization's request. We taped all our interviews, we transcribed all our interviews. I put them all in qualitative software called NVivo and coded them thematically to see what emerged. And our research team for this study was Anjali, myself, our teaching assistant, and our project coordinator for the course. And we trained our project coordinator and our TA before letting them loose in the field. And we also piloted our questions with a few of our partner organizations that happened to be in Boston, be it on business or if this happened to be their location, before we finalized our tools. So what we learned from students, I have a number of quotes here saying, best experience of my MBA. This is my favorite. Please fail me so I can take your class again. One of the best parts of Sloan. I wouldn't ever have imagined I'd be able to use my MBA skills to improve people's lives. Other things we learned in the debrief we did every semester when students came back is usually Anjali would buy the whole class lunch and invite them for an hour and a half to just sort of share about their experiences. And I'd sit there with my computer like a good qualitative researcher and write down what everyone was saying word for word and go home and code it and analyze it. But one of the main themes that came out of some of those debrief sessions was, I cannot believe how my partner organization gets so much done with so little resources. One student said, I cannot believe how scrappy my organization was. I had other students comment on, I had to learn how to work without electricity, and without a computer, and without the Access database I had built to bring to my host organization because I didn't have electricity. Other sort of common themes that emerged from these debriefs were, I learned how to be comfortable with ambiguity. I learned how to be flexible and adaptable. We learned how important it was to develop trust with our host organization. We learned it's really important to talk to everybody in the organization because there's something to learn from everyone here at the clinic. And then they get excited by talking to us and start to buy into our project. So we're hopeful when we leave that this excitement will carry forward in implementing some of our suggestions. And then final thing that comes through is it's really important to manage the scope of the project, to maybe narrow the scope as much as possible, and then manage the expectations of the partner organization. Our next sort of goal in evaluating the student experience that Anjali and I have on the horizon is to do an alumni study of the 153 students that have taken this class and get a survey out to them and see 2 or 3 years post-Sloan, how do you think about GHD Lab now? How has it carried into your career? And then on the flip side, in talking to our partnering organizations, I have a few quotes up here, but what we've learned in going back and speaking with most of them is that 17% of our organizations implemented every recommendation our students gave them. 63% of our organizations implemented some of the recommendations our students left with them. And 20% implemented none of the recommendations our students gave them. Reasons for not implementing were the recommendations were not practical, too complex, we needed too many resources, we failed to follow up, it's our fault as an organization, we didn't carry this out, or you know what, the government pulled our funding, or there was a change in the law and we couldn't implement the recommendations. We noticed that the recommendations that were implemented tended to be implemented in certain areas, like finance, capacity, and increases in efficiency, as well as recommendations in improved customer service and marketing. Here's just another fun quote I'll put up for you. We also did ask the organizations what we can do better in sort of Anjali's experimental process of always improving the class and the experience for our hosts. We did ask, what can we do better? And as she alluded to last night, 60% of our organizations asked for a more ongoing relationship, asked for more of us, asked for more of our student time, asked for increased engagement in some way. They also commented on better preparing our students for the setting, which we struggle with every time we run this class. How can we prepare them best for being in Africa or in India? And better communication with the host organizations is also something that we're constantly working on and is something that we get feedback on could be better for our hosts. Positive things about working with MIT that we hear from our hosts. They like having an outside perspective. They enjoy having a team of 4 students come and bring knowledge and a perspective that is new to them. They love having the students there to focus on a project for 2 or 3 weeks that might have been on their back burner for a long time. And they also appreciate the value of the MIT brand and the high quality of our students and the solutions that they offer to our organizations. And in closing, something that Anjali and I have to constantly remind ourselves as we're evaluating the course is it really is possible to deliver positive impact for our students and our partnering organizations. So thank you very much.
In teaching students to be very good diagnosticians and make meaningful recommendations and meaningful deliverables, isn't that training them in the wrong kind of leadership for the future? Because my sense of what the leader of the future needs is to back off, be a helper, learn how to delegate, learn how to be a servant leader. And since I wrote a lot about process consultation, which is all about not making recommendations, but helping clients to fix their own problems, I'm a little bit puzzled how the kind of training these students get will make them better leaders. It'll certainly make them a certain kind of consultant, but will it make them better leaders? So it's a tough question. I'm not sure there's an answer to it.
Do you want me to try and answer that question?
So I think, do you want to?
No, not really.
Okay, so she doesn't want to.
I was going to say, that's why we're doing our alumni study.
What I'm
Maybe
going
we'll
to do
add
is
something to our
invite
study.
you back to the table
Thank
and
you.
use this as an excellent intro to the fact that we're talking here today about borderless learning, right? And about action learning in the international context. And it is indeed, I think, a question. And I'd like to kick this off by rephrasing Professor Schein's question. So how do we ideally set up this learning context? Because it is a learning context, right? And it's not just consultancy. And I know this because I've done a study of the various approaches, at least in business schools, and on action learning. Some prefer not to talk about consulting for this specific reason that, consulting is different. You're promising either too much or too little when you say that your students are consultants. And then it all depends what you mean by consultants. And in Mr. Schein's world, it should ideally be someone who doesn't recommend things. And I'm sure there are process consultants out there who do that. So how do you broadly set up the learning context? And I'd like to kind of do a full lineup. And Martin, you've been quiet and wonderful, which is hard to do for a long time. Why don't you kick this off? How do you set up the learning context?
I'm terrible at answering the question because I found it so difficult to work with students on this particular topic. They're fairly young and somewhat inexperienced, even though they may have worked for more than 10 years. But therefore, I always come back to the context that Professor Schein has given us. On the outside, learning can be easy. As a matter of fact, can be cool. And we were in Africa and in India, and we did those things, and we had an impact. The next level is, of course, the norms and values. What have we learned about the norms and values? And we can get into that if you stay away long enough and you deal with lack of power and familiar things. But underneath that is, I think, what Professor Schein is addressing. What are the basic assumptions about the learning that we do as leaders or as followers in a project like that? And I think that's very difficult to do. The only experience that I myself had was back in Holland when I did these, what we now call action learning sets, we surely didn't call it then, was with dropping people in unfamiliar settings like the red light district, if you forgive me for that transgression. But we did drop people there and let them struggle for a little bit with their visionary impact, with their physical intelligence, as I like to call it. How did they protect each other and themselves? And of course, we filmed it, and then we gave them feedback. So there was a way to, I hate to say it, to some extent shock, but I think it's more like sandpaper, to sand them a little bit from the outside in, right, towards their own perception of value. So setting that up, I did with executives in India at the same time. They were much more experienced, but they were equally protected by this notion of we have to deliver value. It's got to be X amount of dollars, it's got to have X amount of impact, not for profit or not. So I struggle with it to apply that to the fairly comfortable MBA environment.
David, can I take this to you? Isn't there a conflict between, in academia, but structuring and discussing and making methodologies out of action learning that it actually, it standardizes and we become so good at it. So Taki, you said we have the most robust program. Stanford, I'm sure you have a robust program. MIT would like to think we have a model, it works, it's good. But isn't there something, when we standardize, when we make things better, how do we still keep that destabilizing element that Martin is talking about? Have you met this challenge in your own work?
Well, okay. Standing back from what I talked about, which is a totally different framework of thinking about action learning in terms of what Yuri talked about today, but to go into a classroom.
It doesn't have to be the classroom. I mean, in any action learning context, in industry or otherwise, how do you create that destabilizing context, if that is the ideal, and without having the prescriptions for how people should do it?
Right? You don't have to teach destabilizing because life is destabilizing. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We have to deal with those on an ongoing basis. I think if you have the environment in a group, whether it's in a classroom, and particularly in say, executive education. I mean, I've said for years, and I still do, that the best work as a research methodology for action-oriented research, whether it's action learning, action research, collaborative research, is actually the process consultation and its helping book. And I do that a lot with students. not on something that's way out there, but on something they're working on. So the old techniques that we used years ago of triads, and A shares an issue and B tries to help them, and C observe, and then C tries to help A and B learn from what they learned, and they go around in cycles and so on. Using, for example, your different forms of inquiry and so on. I think learning to listen to yourself and learning to listen to someone else and trying to deal with what is destabilizing, in other words, relationships, unfolding relationships, nothing is static. I think they're critical skills, and I think Ed's question is actually central.
So Maria, you and I last night talked briefly about something we're trying to start doing here at MIT, which is working a little bit more with what we call the host organization. So, you know, the people that you charge 100,000 from, Göran, and the organizations we work with, and how do we work with them to create this idea that they are also part of the learning. And this is not just your standard consultancy where we recommend things for them to do, but they're actually part of the process.
And I think that's a huge challenge, and it is one of the reasons why we actually don't do consultancy projects as any part of this global experience requirement, because the sponsoring organization has a particular expectation, and particularly if they're paying a lot of money, that they're going to get an outcome that becomes the priority versus the learning experience for the students. And our priority is the learning experience for the students. So when I go to find sponsoring organizations for our internships, as an example, I'm up front with them and I say, I'm asking a favor of you. I'm asking you to help in the learning experience, the learning journey for our students, and it's going to take some work on your part, and all you're really going to get in return is a really bright young person for 4 weeks, and we hope that that will be a positive outcome for you. But, and I tend to go after alumni, as a favor to the school, we would like you to provide a project. The other point I want to make, though, is the example I gave was really about becoming a servant leader. And that's why I think it is the most powerful example, as opposed to going into a sponsoring organization or doing an internship or whatever, is that challenge of becoming self-aware, to understand yourself as a leader, to have to lead peers, and peers with extraordinarily high expectations, and do a form of influence management, in the sense of you have to garner respect without actually having any power. Those are the most important skills that they will actually end up leveraging when they go out into the real world, and why I particularly pointed out that as the best learning experience. As soon as you add in a company, a sponsor, a consulting arrangement, the priority shifts. And so we do those. We put students into internships, but it's 100% about putting them into a new, destabilizing, challenging place. They've never been to India before. They have to go do an internship in Bangalore. They have to get to work every day. They have to go grocery shopping. They have to figure out their way. That's really the learning opportunity in those situations. Yes, they happen to be doing a project for a sponsor, but we package those more as what's it like to learn to be working in Beijing or Lagos or wherever the location would be. So it is tough.
Thanks. So Göran, why don't we use you as the scapegoat here for the most crystallized, pure play kind of consultancy student gig, and how do you defend that?
Well, I mean, I think our priority is not like other schools and institutions, and that's why we're such an outlier. We tell the students, both the client and the students, that client satisfaction is paramount, and that their learning is right up there. But if clients are going to pay, 6 figures for something, they're going to expect something they're going to get from, or something close to, a Bain, BCG, and McKinsey, et cetera. And that's how we pitch it. And that's something that is just one of the many offerings that we have at Tuck. It's not just similar to Stanford. We have a first-year program. We have, other opportunities for students to do, whether it's learning expeditions, whether it's a study abroad, whether it's something that's maybe not as focused on the client and more sort of an inward focus. So
may I ask you then, is your program, as the name says, more of a teaching? I mean, the aim is to teach students to be consultants more than to teach them to be leaders, which was Professor Schein's contention.
Probably, or at least expose them to consultancy and see, because hey, I don't want to do consulting, so I want to just get a flavor for it, or this is all I want to do and this is what I want to get out of my experience at Tux. So the focus isn't so much on leadership per se, but certainly those skills come into play.
Okay, briefly, and then Aaron.
Isn't that the role then of the facilitator, the learning facilitator that travels with the team to make sure that that personal development is there to become a better leader?
Part of their responsibility would be to do that, but ultimately it goes back to, are the students hitting the milestones they're supposed to be, especially during those 3 weeks, to ensure that at the end the client is satisfied with what they're getting from that project.
And there's nothing wrong with the client being satisfied either. Erin, I wanted to ask you lastly, how do you see this tension, and what do people learn in GHD Lab? Do they learn all this thing, borderless, international leadership skill, or is it?
We'd like to think so.
Yes.
I also think like I said, we'd love to do an alumni survey to see 2 years, 3 years out what their reflections are from what they learned in the course, besides what we just collect upon when they return to Boston. But I also think what we have done, one of our units of analysis for our study was the recommendation, which is whatever the students have handed in for deliverables, whether it's their deck or their model or their process. But we are trying to push them towards more implementation, starting the implementation process with their hosts while they're there. So they're not just leaving here, do these things, we're out of here. And Anjali spoke a little bit to this last night, in that we're trying to get them thinking about implementation and process and how to help the organizations actually do things better before they leave. The other thing we're thinking about, based on what we've heard from our hosts in terms of wanting more of us, is how do we more continuously engage these organizations in a year-long relationship, so that we're not just going there in the spring, or it's not just a spring project, but how do we stay in touch and continue on with them? I mean, something that we did find that was an emergent finding from our study was most of our hosts are keeping in contact with our students after they've left, and we didn't know that. That's something that wasn't known to us, but over 60% of our projects are still talking to at least one student, and that could be 2.5 years later.
Thank you, Maria.
I just wanted to add one more point to this. A lot of these examples that we've given could be just as effective if they happened in Iowa or Alabama versus internationally. And the one thing that I just wanted to point out here is, in addition to helping them to learn to be leaders, we are trying to enhance their global mindset, to help them understand that you can no longer just there is no such thing as just being a leader in a single context. Global business, global economy, that's the only way to do business anymore. And so all of these experiences, dropping them into parts of the world that they've never been in before, is about expanding this global mindset, this understanding of the differences and the challenges and the opportunities that come from working across different countries. So I don't want to lose that. I mean, there's learning to be a leader, but there's learning to be a leader across the diversity of the world.
Let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll summarize, and then JD after.
This may almost be a question of a heretic. I've been recently doing some work inside one of the major consulting firms in the country, helping them write a large proposal. And the team is largely composed of incredibly bright, relatively young, recent MBA students who have struck me over the past couple of months as being fairly naive because they rush to a solution as opposed to ask a sufficient number of questions. And the team that I'm working with, the outsiders who are working with this group on the proposal, are constantly saying, but you're missing this, you're not looking at this, from the organization's perspective, you're looking at it from inside. And I wonder if the real issue is that we're training MBA students who are far too young. And whether there's got to be a substantial period of work experience before you enter that world where you think you're an expert, and you're hardly an expert. I mean, they're incredibly bright people, but they rush to solutions, to Ed's comment.
Can we take JD's question together with that, so we can just have a last round with the panel, if it's very brief?
And actually, it plays directly into this same question. I'm curious about, how do you train the students to not come in with a Western mindset, we're here to solve this problem for you, but to actually engage with the client. So it's similar to what was asked earlier, but also that especially when you're going from first world to third world issues, how do you help that cultural gap?
We'll take one or two more questions, as in just a question. Yes?
Thank you. Burning question that I have that was touched upon last night is, where is the role of, and this might get to your point too, the role of theory, or having a theoretical framework, you know, training MBA students in particular, because that seems to be the audience, you know, to look at issues from a different perspective so they're not reinventing the wheel the whole time.
All right, unless there, okay, one last burning question, and then the panel will have the task of remembering all this and saying meaningful things. Thank you.
My question is going to be very brief. So when we've sent various programs overseas, we've taken the approach of how to basically culturally acclimate the students, and we've kind of used, there's a spectrum, and we've landed at multiple points on that spectrum before. So there's the bare minimum of basically telling them this is what the currency is, this is what the power socket that you need to have is, and you're off on your way, and you figure it out as you go, versus having an extremely robust, you know, kind of cultural training program. I was wondering if you had a preference based on experience where that falls.
All right, so the way we're going to do this now is, this is now the end, so we will summarize, and you will have a maximum of a very short time to elucidate some of these points. There you go. Each of you.
I don't mind starting as I started earlier. I think it's a real challenge, the maturity level, meaning, I hated that word when I grew up, by the way. When am I going to be mature? Well, you have to make a lot of mistakes. You have to falter forward, as we like to say here. And there is a theory that goes with that. I banked this on Professor Charles Hamden Turner, who came up with this idea of dilemma management, but we've also seen it in duality management, in what was his name, Johnson, who wrote a book on paradox management and so on. I do think there is a theory for students, less experienced managers, to look at two opposing value orientations that are equally right and equally good and need to become true at the same time. We call it reconciliation, and Charles has really furthered that. Yet, in the business schools, the majority of the courses are, this is the way to do it. And you learn it, and you do it, and you apply it, and yes, you are successful. And that's why earlier my joke of MBAs are mediocre but arrogant. And unfortunately, or fortunately for people who work after they leave MBAs and come into business, there's a lot of retraining to be done, particularly in the area of trust the process, but ask open questions. And trust the process is the action learning process, as we all shared it and will continue to share it this afternoon. That, I think, is so important. And trusting the process means patience and reflection. Why are you constantly giving me solutions? I didn't have a problem before you came in. And that I see over and over and over again. And there, the servant leader, when was it, 1977, Greenleaf? What have we learned, really? And it also, a servant leader is an reflective practitioner in the Reven's way of thinking about it. So that role within academia, I think we have to develop, and there are people with great skills who can already do it, then teach it, and then measure it. And that comes down to what I call the assumptions that I grew up with, spoon-fed. I had no clue until I confronted myself and was confronted by lots of you and other friends and foes who gave me free feedback. And that is a crucial element of learning and development.
Thank you. David, do you have?
Yeah, just two comments. One is for Reven's, MBA stood for Management Bankruptcy Assured. Right? Because he had a healthy disrespect for experts. And all the comments that are being made about MBAs and so on. I suppose what's depressing me is that, in fact, what we're talking about, we've known for 40 years. You know, you say, what happened to Greenleaf? You know, what's happened to process consultation since 1969 when you wrote the first book? I mean, we know all this before. Lewin said this 70 years ago, and so on, no action without learning it. But yet we keep reinventing, we just keep struggling, we keep getting locked into into that. And it's the issue really is the educational system, particularly the higher educational system in business. A woman heard Revans talk about action learning once, and she went up to him after and she said, "Professor Revans, this action learning is very interesting." And he said, "What are you going to do about it?" He always, if anybody came up with a theory question, he'd always say to them, "What are you going to do about it?"
I wanted to address the question you had about how to prepare them, sort of what the theory is behind the experience themselves, because I think that's a real challenge. At Stanford, we have a required core class that every student takes as soon as they arrive called the Global Context and Management. And it really is an opportunity for them to create a lens or a process or a theory of how to approach the complexities of global issues, whether it's around markets or culture or technology, et cetera, so that by the time that they do any of these experiences, they are doing it with this lens in mind. And I think the challenge is to how much time do you want to spend with their seats in a classroom teaching the theory versus the action learning aspect of it, where they're out there figuring it out for themselves. Where is the balance? We all recognize that they're more likely to take away and remember what happens when they're out in the field in the country doing it. But the more of a lens we can give them so they're not recreating the wheel and starting from scratch, the faster they can take that in. So it is something that we struggle with all the time. And then I wanted to make one comment about the age of MBA students. I graduated from Stanford with an MBA a long time ago, and it was always a conversation that we had in a challenge. We had a range of students that were probably 22 to 41 or something to that extent. And over time, the age of MBA students has actually decreased. And as my understanding is, the pressure primarily comes from faculty. And I'm a little bit of a cynic here, but the faculty find it a lot easier to teach to a younger, more malleable audience than to teach to an audience that already has a tremendous amount of real-world experience. Of course. And so the balance is, does the faculty want to be challenged by people who have had 15 years of experience, or do they want the opportunity to put their ideas and their learning into the heads before the students go out?
Maria, that is so, in India, for example, even and I'm not a professor, I have no PhD, I've never thought hard about anything, I just have an MBA and I'm a lawyer, so shoot me. But there I get the reverence of a professor, because that's how the country treats professors. But to get them to challenge me is near impossible. And I get hundreds of emails from Indians, and I'm a friend with I don't know how many Indians on LinkedIn, because they all want to link with me. Why? Because they all say, finally a professor that I can call Martin. Finally a professor that I can challenge on his own stories. And so there's a need for that. I'm shocked to hear that indeed here we hear of professors that like them young and gullible.
So here's a chair that's called Tron, and he says a very brief comment from Göran and a very brief comment from Erin, and then because we respect Professor Schein's wish to have a last little word, we will also do that. But then we need to eat.
Yeah, just very quickly on your comment about students or management consulting teams rushing to a conclusion and maybe students going in already thinking they know the answer. When we staff our teams, we ensure that there's diversity, not just where the students are from, gender, work experience, et cetera, but if the subject matter, for example, is heavily focused on finance, we ensure that there's somebody on the team that either knows very little about finance, hopefully not because there's a finance courses at Tuck, but can bring some sort of objectivity and just why are you doing it this way? Why are we asking these questions and so on and so forth? And then we encourage the team advisors as well to, question the team, if they're going down this road, why are you doing this way? And kind of challenge them a little bit to make sure that not everyone's thinking the same way because they could be heading down the wrong path. So.
Erin?
I think to the question about how do you get students to leave the Western mindset behind, for our class, a lot of our students are second-year MBAs who have already taken a project class, maybe taken a project class in another setting in China or India or somewhere else that MIT goes. Some of them have been on the ground before. We also have a number of international students that take our class. So sometimes leaving the Western mindset behind is something that they've achieved before they come to us. And if not, I think to Maria's point, once they get on the ground, the majority of them, things start to click that they'd been hearing from us in our class the 6 weeks before they leave.
So before I pass the last word to Professor Schein, I just wanted to say one reflection I had on what Maria said about authority and what we're actually teaching faculty in these courses, right? One observation of mine would be, in a borderless international environment, it is actually not so obvious that faculty always has the answers too. And in some ways, that's kind of an advantage because you're teaching as a mentor, well knowing that you don't know every detail about all of these crazy contexts that we're sending students out to. And that actually, certainly for me, becomes liberating because then you know that you are a facilitator. I couldn't possibly, when I traveled to Indonesia this spring or to Beijing, into China, think that I knew something more than the students that had just been working 4 weeks on both the problem and the context, and I had been handling lots of different teams. Why don't you have a quick word, and then we will eat.
This is something I'll probably elaborate on later, but I can never resist teaching moments. We talk about reflection, 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 but you know what we never do? We never reflect on our own culture. And a lot of these problems of what's it like to be a consultant might be helped if those MBAs took a little time saying, who are we? What's our age? What's the US like? What are the values we're taking out there? It's amazing to me how we reflect about everything else except our own culture.
And with those wise words, I just want to remind you that this has been a session about action learning and international engagement, learning to lead in a borderless environment, and may that be our mantra that what was said this morning, the smartest person in the room may not always have the right answer. So whether or not we think we are the smartest, I think the interesting thing is to have the good questions and then see what the context leads to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.